Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is so excited. Happy to see all the friends writing on the chat box. And welcome, very welcome to the first edition of BEHR Virtual Summit, the summit where behavioral economics meets HR world. Today, we are going to have amazing talks. Let me remember you the dynamic. We are going to have a 40-minute talks, and then the last 10 minutes for questions and answers. If you can see the chat box on YouTube, please recharge your page. Today we are going to open the conference with one of a kind. I probably say he is my mentor. Talking about HR. He is Perry Teams. He is the founder of PTHR. He is the Chief Energy Officer with plus 30 years experience in people, learning, technology, organization, change, and transformation. He is an author of two books. The first, Transformational HR, and the second, Energized Workplaces. I highly recommend the reading of these two books if you want to improve your HR vision. Dear friend, Perry, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm really good, my friend. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And what an honor to be the first speaker to kick off this amazing thing that you've created, friend. So props to you. It's an amazing achievement.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much, Perry. It's a great honor to have you on board as the first speaker of the first edition of the BEHR Summit. I don't want to take your time. We are looking forward to hearing you. It's your time, my friend. Let's go.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Fran. So yeah, it is a genuine honor. So thanks everybody who's joined us today on this. And of course, we have almost like a rolling festival here that Fran's created for us. So we have tomorrow and we have Friday too. Yeah, so I'll confess to being absolutely energized about my work, which is why the second book came out in the way that it did. And I'm going to talk to you today about a concept and I guess some of the insight that I found in 10 years of very active study and an application on the concept of self-managed teams. So I am going to share screen. So I'm going to go to some visuals for you so that you don't have to look through me, and feel free to take some screen grabs throughout if you want to. If anybody wants copies of the slides or wants to talk to me afterwards, I'm not difficult to track down on things like LinkedIn. But yes, what I wanted to talk about was behaviors in self-managed teams. I guess as an HR professional, one of the things I'm seeing now is a continued adaptation to what we do in HR. And of course, behavioral economics is something that's emerged over the last few years. And HR is taking note of and actually probably having to work in environments where behavioral economics is at play. And I'll sort of underscore some of those as we go through. So without further ado, a little bit more about what we do at PTHR. I won't say we're behavioral economics leaning practitioners, but what we are is activists, and we are very concerned about the state of the world of work, and we do want to completely overhaul it and radicalize it and make it something better for people. So we start from a human-centered and design thinking kind of concept, and of course that has behaviors and needs at the heart of it. And we're very much into the interconnectedness then between people and systems, so organization, design, development, very much part of our practice field. And we do like to practice things that have agile, inclusive, and as it says, they're self-managed ways of working. So we're 8 people across the globe in 4 time zones. We're entirely self-managed. I'm leader only in like nomination and I guess kind of legality. But yeah, less about us, more about the people we work with. Are these self-managed companies? No, they're not. Are these companies that have degrees of autonomy, agility, inclusion? Yes, they are. And the reason quite a few of these companies have come to us to work with is because in part they want to start to demonstrate how more inclusive, aligned and agile ways of working can help them. So that's the portfolio. But we're here today to have a look at this. So this is my definition that I guess I've sort of harvested from various sources about behavioral economics. So what is it? A method of economic analysis that applies psychological insights into human behavior to explain economic decision making. So largely there is a connection to things of value. I think that's the word I'd like to see included in behavioral economics, about how we can adjust behaviors that are in the essence of creating value for people, collective groups of people, organizations, communities, societies, whatever it may be. That's the kind of definition I'm working to, psychological insights. And so my hypothesis, I guess, for this talk is this: what part may behavioral economics play in creating more self-managed organizations, or SMOs, that are economically viable and flourishing places to work? I'm really tired of seeing the tension between a good place to work and an effective profit-making enterprise or budget responsible enterprise, and seeing the two as either or choices. I don't believe we have to have that all the time. I believe we can bring together good for people who are employees and collaborators and suppliers and partners, and good for profit and budget responsibility. So I don't think the two are as polarized as we have unfortunately made them. And so I'm going to lean on the work of some experts with this. So Amy Edmondson, the Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School, and Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior at INSEAD, Michael Lee. Now, these two practitioners and researchers and academics do happen to have a very strong leaning towards the exploration of post-hierarchical working. And so these are quotes from some research that Edmondson and Lee collaborated on a few years ago. Formal hierarchies are as persistent as calls for its replacement. There seems to be a growing voice of objection to the structural rigidity of formal hierarchies, yet they persist and prevail. And so we've then got the comment about hierarchies prevailing in the belief that management power is the primary mechanism for ensuring performance. So in that sort of tension there, we have people saying, but why do we need hierarchies all the time? It's so stifling. And then we have the concept that hierarchies in themselves are fixed in a belief that management power is how we get performance. And today I'm hoping to bring to light some examples where that's not the case, and show you where the economics of behavior and the architecture of choice are much more prevalent. And so here we see some real depth of thought from Edmondson and Lee. So it's so much better to be in a workplace where you can be your real self and contribute to the work in a meaningful way. I think we are now seeing the surge of people having not just a desire but an expectation that their work and the meaning of what they do is very clear and almost omnipresent every day. And of course, if we go back to some research in the 60s and 70s, Burns and Salter particularly, who looked at English and Scottish organisations, and Henry Mintzberg from Canada, who looked at a range of organisations, concluded actually hierarchies, when there is stability, are incredibly effective. And then if we look, though, at the research that Edmondson and Lee put together, hierarchies are seriously challenged in dynamic conditions: turbulence in change, expansion of knowledge work, and work as increasing places of meaning. So it's almost counter what we're starting to see as a desire from people who step into the workplace, that they want to connect their personal values and meaning in their lives with the work that they do. Yet hierarchies seem to almost choke and suppress that kind of natural occurrence. And Lee's going on to talk about this on a podcast with the fantastic Lisa Gill, the Demorphosis. Research shows that types of behaviours conducive to better dynamics are all risky behaviours in most hierarchical structures. So if we're looking at where does nudge and behavioural economics sit in the current hierarchical setups, it exists in the power of managers and in the hierarchical cascade. So the behavioural economics that we're seeing in hierarchical organisations is largely one way. What do the bosses think they can do to make the employees adopt and adapt in a way they think is determining success, and not a collective intelligence and then a sort of a flow of behavioural economics up, down and across. And then if we look at some very, very recent research from KPMG, they looked at what organisations have done in response to COVID-19. And what we see here is reaction, some resilience, some recovery, and some new reality. And I think what we're seeing there is instantaneous immediate overnight type responses, some conducted in hierarchical senses, but we've had to respond to that. And then there's been all this uncertainty about whether we're in or out of an office, whether we're good at working from home or not, whether we miss people, or whether we actually love the focus and concentration we now have. And then there's on to recovery, and that often says, well, let's get back to how we were, and that's almost an overly romanticized version of what might be. And if you can hear a bit of background, it's because we've got an incredible rainstorm here at the moment in the UK. But the new reality is adapting to a new world. And I think if we take the words and advice from Edmondson and Lee's research, that adaptation will be somewhat difficult with a hierarchically controlled behavioural economics leveraged approach. And there's already some research that's been done and models created. And so this one, the Cynefin framework, the work most famously sort of, I guess, popularized by Dave Snowden when he was at IBM in the early 2000s, talks to the need to respond, act, decide, use evidence in different situations. And so I think what we've seen with COVID is we've seen an initial chaotic response. It happened pretty quickly that governments edicted lockdown. So we had to act, and then we had to make sense of what's going on, and then we had to compile our responses. And that moves through into complex, complicated, and then, of course, into simple. And as we remember from Mintzberg's research and others, hierarchies perform well where it's simple. I just don't think the business world at the moment sits very easily in the simple category within this model. It's more in the complex, often chaotic, and I think also complicated arena. But then if I take that model to something that was popularized during the rise and resurgence, I suppose you'd say, of agile working, and particularly the Spotify model of squads, they have determined, just the essence of how hierarchies and management structures versus no management versus agile self-management. And we can see how this maps very nicely to the Cynefin framework. The simplistic systems tend to be where there's absolutely no room for maneuver, and it's very strictly controlled by managers. That's the time of stability. That's the hierarchical behavioral economics kind of framework. Where it's a bit more complicated, we tend to have more lower level management, perhaps, helping and orchestrating teams. It's a complicated system, but there's lots more that's known about how to navigate through that complicated aspect. So it's aligned and it's directed by managers, and that's what I think we see prevailing still in a softer version, perhaps, of hierarchies. And then if people just completely discard the hierarchy and say, well, this is so awful, let's just, free up everybody to do what they believe they can do, we could end up back in chaos. We could end up in complete random, distracted and perhaps even differentiating sets of direction, because people think, well, I'm just going to do what I want. I've got nobody to control me. I'm free. I'm liberated. I can do absolutely everything I've always dreamed of. But that may not be in the interests of the collective, the organization, society, community that it operates in. So again, in essence, the Spotify model of aligned and autonomous working is where a complex system is at play. I'm guided in what to do, but I decide how to do it. I have agency. I have choice. I am acting in choice architecture that I feel I have a significant influence in being part of and creating. Often it's emergent, but it's definitely directed by self. So I think we can see the kind of coming together of a few models that give us a sense of really what's at play when we can disassemble the behavioral economic pressure that comes from a hierarchical structure into more self-managed organizations. So it is this choice architecture. And within self-management, research often tells you there are normally two pathways that people take. They're kind of opposite, but perhaps they're nearer to each other than we might think. But one is radical and one is incremental. And let's have a look at a few variations that might give us a sense of, if we're thinking now that we also believe that the behavioral economic pressure that comes through a hierarchy is maybe not in everybody's best interest, particularly in a complex environment, and we want to go to more self-managed organizations, how might we do it? So Edmondson and Lee's work identified three real archetypes within self-management frameworks of varying degrees of partial, whole, or hybrid kind of self-management. So if we're looking at the behavioural economics aspects of it, I'm going to sort of unpack these three and give you a sense of where I'm coming from with the nature of the framework, I guess, of operating in a self-managed way. Post-bureaucratic organisations, very hot topic at the moment with the recent release of the book Humanocracy by Gary Hamel and Michele Zanini. So that's one worth checking out, Humanocracy. Humanistic management organizations. So I'll give you some examples of what I think we mean by humanistic, both in story and in some kind of components and elements. And then the concept of organizational democracy. Again, something I've been very close to for a number of years and practiced by a number of organizations. And we'll have a look at some of those too. So if we look at post-bureaucratic, this is the kind of nature of what you'd expect to see and sense and feel for a post-bureaucratic self-managed organization. Flatter structures, much more fluidity, and much more organic aspects to them. So they feel less mechanistic and almost welded and fused and much more fluid and adaptable. So I guess the phrase that comes to mind is Nassim Nicholas Taleb's anti-fragile. And then we see that flex is valued higher than efficiency. It's not to say that efficiency isn't valued, but the ability to flex is valued and treasured more, because that will ensure that there's continued efficiency as things around change, disrupt, and completely, reorient people. The network structure of control, so not at the apex and the higher echelons of the organization, but dispersed and all about interconnectedness, about relationships, about trust, and about this whole sense that it's more of a hierarchical sense than a hierarchical sense, a phrase that was introduced to the world by John Husband. Definite noticing of horizontal communication patterns. So instead of corporate propaganda coming from top and being consumed or ignored by people through the chain, this is much more about communication that comes across the organization, goes diagonal up and flows across. Often you can tell what the real structure of your organization is, whether it's drawn out or otherwise, on the communication flow. That will give you the sense of who's in power, who has the influence, who directs. Fluid and ambiguous roles. So as well as a system that values flex, the roles themselves are fluid and ambiguous. And this is almost counterintuitive to the way that I guess HR practitioners exercise a little bit of behavioral economics on people through job descriptions, competency profiles, and the reward mechanics that they use off the back of those. These are roles where people are committed to the cause and will flex and change as they need to. So this is not about deep diving experts. This is often about people who could become more neo-generalist, adaptive, and more polymath-like. And so what we see in a post-bureaucratic organization is that autonomous action prevails over top-down authority. So see a problem, sense a problem, bring it to people's attention, bring people with you, solve the problem. You don't need to put a business case up through a sclerotic bureaucratic administrative system to then get the sanction to go ahead. By that time, the problem's either exasperated or some other damage has been done further down the line. So I think this is about responsiveness and about having hundreds of pairs of eyes rather than just a top team who can decide on when to act. And that post-bureaucratic organizations often look more like communities where the trust and social bonds actually bind people and give them the sense of belonging to something. I think it's a myth that we've heard that people leave organizations not because the organization is rubbish, but because the manager's pretty poor. I think people leave organizations because they don't feel a sense of belonging and they don't feel like they can change and influence it to enhance that sensation. That may be a managerial blockage. That may be because the system itself is entirely corrupted and therefore they feel helpless in order to change that, so they go to take it somewhere else. But a community like post-bureaucratic organization works things out. You've got a networked communication structure, and you've got people around who you can rely on and trust and build relationships with to affect those changes. And then we've got humanistic management. And so this is something that's possibly recognizable to a few of you, because you may have seen some of these more virtuous organizations, both adopting some really nice processes of looking after people during COVID-19 responses, but also we've heard the stories where we've got companies who value people. Dan Price at Gravity Payments in Seattle, as an example, where, you know, they're not a self-managed organization, but he put everybody on $75,000 including himself, taking a huge pay cut. That's almost like a humanistic, egalitarian kind of approach. So McGregor in the 1960s would have called this a theory Y type principle of participatory management. And again, participatory management is something that Gary Hamel talks about in Humanocracy. Reduces formal and informal hierarchy. So actually, even if we say, let's get rid of the hierarchy, let's not have anybody sat in glass offices and so on, there could still be an informal hierarchy with, you know, people having reverence for people holding particular titles or having levels of experience. But a humanistic management structure is such that it will bring in a much more informal family feel, so that there isn't the natural kind of connection to hierarchies. Influences, autonomy and satisfaction tend to be features of humanistic management, where people feel they're regarded as an individual, they're looked after, they're given a sense that they belong in that particular world. And it shifts any hierarchical relationships that are there. It doesn't have to be a non-hierarchical arrangement to be humanist, so that it is much more about the relationship to motivation and belonging, and people have this sense of perception of self-efficacy, so they can change things, they have a voice, and people will listen to them and regard it. So supervision is very light touch, reward is often very transparent, no secret bonuses. Often people know exactly how you get monetary and other forms of benefit. And job design is often, again, a very open and participative element in a humanistic management organization. And so it's built on empowerment and delegation. Now, that's a thing I'm not so keen on. Empowerment is often where people are gifting people a sense of agency, but the fact that it's a gift, it almost feels like it could be taken away at any minute. So I often go at loggerheads with people who use the word empowerment. It's not as generous as it may seem. And so therefore this stuff can fail, because there are sometimes mixed messages. I'm empowering you to make a decision. I made a decision, it cost us some money. Well, that's rubbish. You're on a performance review because you wasted some money. It's like, but I've got the agency to make the decision. So mixed messages can come from this. And that's where I think we see the locus of control at play. And so we've also got this sense of then organizational democracy, where people have a voting right. It's almost like a kind of Unitarian approach, so that people have the ability to influence decisions and direction. This is where we could use an example like the John Lewis Group in the United Kingdom, where employees are called partners, and employees are almost like challenging the chief executive and have a say and an influence on certain elements of direction for the entire company. Free and full communication, so again, very open in an organizational democratic sense. Often there could be even employee ownerships and shares and stakes in organizations like these. So we may see democracy coming through the element of co-ownership. And where we could see some and obviously evident decentralization of authority, so that there's a formal and systematic way throughout the organization where people can vote, make choices, and provide some kind of consensus and I guess you'd say sort of, again, agency in how to direct the organization and people around them. Well, that's great, but let's have a look at some organizations that have either taken some radical or incremental choices about this. And so some behavioral economics is at play in what they're doing. But I think what we'll see is this is all incredibly ethical kind of behavioral economics. It's co-created behavioral economics. It's very open. So it isn't any of the manipulative stuff that you might have read about in books like Hooked by Nir Eyal. And so again, let's remind ourselves of complex, complicated, chaotic and simple environments. So let's keep that in mind. So post-bureaucratic organizations then. Here's one of my favorites, and I talk about this a lot. It's currently featured in books like Humanocracy and Brave New Work by Aaron Dignan and Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. So this is Jos de Blok and the story of Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, the home-based healthcare organization. So teams of 12 nurses working in Behaviours administer health services direct to citizens across the Netherlands. And the reason it's a post-bureaucratic organisation comes in a few ways. De himself has admitted at an event that I saw him speak at that Behaviours has never had a strategy because nobody's ever asked for one. Now, that's an incredible confession that an organisation now that's 15,000 people, that has the highest healthcare patient satisfaction rates in the world, and that is frequently the best employer voted for by Dutch employees, has never had a strategy. It's never sat down and directed a particular strategy that people can follow, partly because it's a post-bureaucratic organisation. It doesn't need one. It's been an incremental growth, but a radical step that De took. So if you want to know the sort of behavioural economics that De is using, then he is saying to people who want to join Behaviours, we're all about nursing. We're not about statistical analysis and filling in forms and KPIs. You will work on a team and you will effectively be an enterprise within. So if you need to recruit people, you're HR. If you need to talk about reward and payment of overtime, you're HR and management. If you need to make decisions on patient care and procurement and suppliers, that's what you do in your team of 12. So I guess the adjustment that he's made is he has given people entire rights within a framework that's obviously compliant and legal. All De has is about 50 people working in his headquarters. So he's not using manipulative behavioural economics. He is giving people the space to run an enterprise with the ethics that he knows people step into nursing with, and run that enterprise as if it's their own. Now, if you look at the economic side of behavioural economics, people often say, but how does this compare to a very efficiently run KPI engine-like healthcare system that has optimal artificial intelligence plotting how quickly to get from one patient house to another? And the good news is, on two comparisons, both De organisation and dare I say it, a little bit more MBA-led type of organisation, operating costs are identical. So De is not spending any more money by having less controls. De is seeing people spend money wisely, and so he's not having ballooning procurement and costs that are out of control because they're not centrally managed. So this is proof that actually, again, behavioural economics is often about nudging people to the right outcome. But I think what we're talking about here is the nudging is simply to give people the belief, the trust, and the agency and the structures and the mechanisms to work things out themselves. That's why they're a post-bureaucratic organisation, and that's why they're so successful. And then the other company that I always talk about and adore is Menlo Innovations, based in Michigan. So this is not 15,000 nurses this time. This is 80 people who are technologists working in Michigan. And of course, at the moment, like everybody else, work in dispersed ways. But, when you get to go and spend some time like I did at what they call the Joy Factory, Menlo Innovations is a really interesting post-bureaucratic organisation. However, you may notice at the back of the room that there are some cards pinned to a sort of scrum board at the back of the room. So that might say, yeah, but look, they're using bureaucracy. They're writing stuff down on cards. They do that deliberately. They're ethos for open management style is that anybody who wants to know where a project is can just go and walk over to that board and see what it is. Of course, now they'll probably have a digital replication of that where people can have a look at where a project is at. Because the nudges that work in play at Menlo come in a couple of ways. So the first way they've created a really strong commitment to quality is that people work in pairs at Menlo. So whether you're a designer, a researcher, a tester, a coder, whatever you might be, you will always work in a pair. You will often find yourself in the real world sharing one machine, but people are working on the same project at the same time, checking each other's code, checking each other's work. So as a result of that, the behavioural framework they operate in is one of high quality, because you are quite literally, at the moment that somebody is creating a line of code, you're auditing it for them. And then when the roles changed and you're creating code, they're doing the same thing. So they've reduced error detection from weeks and months to literally seconds. And that's really important because their clients are often in places like healthcare. And so they will write software for kidney dialysis machines, heart monitors, incubators for premature babies. So their software's got to work. Now, The interesting thing about Menlo is in their 15 plus years of operating, they've never had a software emergency, which means that every release of their software works. They don't have a customer help desk. So the behavioral economics that's going at play here is you are committed to quality through working with somebody else, and they will pick you up and they will help you get it right, and you'll need to do the same for them. And so this kind of open architecture, I suppose, has given this organization a really unique sense of not needing managerial intervention. So these are post-bureaucratic, non-management led, and a company where quality and the ethics of their client software is absolutely vital. So let's have a look at a couple of humanistic management organizations. And the first one, again, is another favorite of mine in the US. That's Bob Chapman, who is the chief exec of Barry Wehmiller. Barry Wehmiller is an engineering company who will often be found installing conveyor systems and logistics systems inside factories, warehouses, and so on. And so their story of how they're a post-humanistic, actually a humanistic management company, comes from the sense of how Bob treats his employees as members of the family. And in fact, what Bob says is, I have families who gift me their loved ones. So quite literally, it's, you know, a wife, a husband, a son, a cousin, an uncle, whatever it might be. He said, look, I'm hosting all these people who mean something really strongly to other people. And so therefore, I'm going to want to do my part to make sure that when they go home after spending time with me on the clock and earning some money for them, that I'm going to send them back and they're going to be good people. And so that ethos is like, well, that's great. That's nice and easy to say. How does that happen? Very, very open about how they want people to experience life at Barry Wehmiller. Very participative, very collegiate, very community oriented. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Bob very proudly now talks about the fact that Barry Wehmiller as a company has the lowest divorce rate of any other company in the US. Not a KPI they created. However, a KPI they're incredibly proud of, because what Bob says is, I don't send my people back to their families grumpy and worn out and tired and irritable, so that there's a kind of conflict and then that spirals and then bad things happen. Quite the opposite. So there's a kind of ethos of that, but also in the reward structure at Barry Wehmiller, there is a very sort of peer nominated kind of employee recognition scheme at Barry Wehmiller. So if you've done good for a team or somebody else, you'll likely get nominated into something, and then you'll get selected out of a draw, and you will win the chance to have an open top sports car for a weekend. Now, you might think, well, that's a bit twee, what good's that? Bob's found it has an incredible effect on people. First thing they do is they love going home to the family and saying, hey, I did good, not because I got the best sales results, but because other people recognized I did something good for them. So there's a real feel good to this. This is a symbolic nature of being humanist. But the thing that genuinely sort of affects Bob about this is he says that if you have people who win the car for the weekend and they've lost relatives, perhaps their parents have died, they'll drive to the headstone, they'll go talk to their parent and say, hey, mum, dad, I did good because this week I got the sports car, as a real sense of some kind of massive recognition that they don't even need a reciprocal response to. So this is a humanistic management thing. This is how you involve people, engage them, and build an organization where actually human beings definitely flourish. And human beings flourishing leads me on to the another company that I've been very fortunate in spending some time and getting to know, Wyden in Wisconsin, a technology company in digital asset management, headed up by the very visionary and very really human Matthew Gonerin, who describes himself not as the chief executive officer, but the chief eudaimonia officer. So eudaimonia is a 5th century Greek term for human flourishing. And so this is an organization built on decentralized, autonomous, democratic principles. This is an organization where if you have an idea for a venture, if you've got enough support from other people, you can test the venture, try it, fly it, and then the company will buy it. Example, while I was in Wisconsin in 2016, user experience and the kind of approach of user experience wasn't something that Wyden had enormous expertise in, but somebody on the team spotted that there was an opportunity to learn it, so she went off and did on her own steam. brought it back, got some people excited and interested in the whole concept of user experience, changed the nature of a piece of software, managed to sell it on and gain 2 enormous clients. So this was business growth through somebody spotting an opportunity and having the agency to do something about. This is an organization that values human beings to the point that a number of the workforce are people with recognized learning disabilities and are finding it really difficult to get employ in the Wisconsin area. Matthew did some research and found that as probably as many as 60 or 70% of people with a kind of condition that's been medically identified could work, but it's a tiny percentage of people who end up finding work. And so Wyden wanted to put that right, and so work with a local partnership and now have members of the team who have some very specific and very important jobs, including Andrew, the popcorn maker. If you want to know a bit more about the popcorn manager role, have a look at Matthew's TEDx video. Okay, organizational democracy then. And so a couple of examples here. One of the biggest cooperatives in the world is the company Mondragon that does everything from consulting services through to mining and quarrying. And so this is a company where, again, it's owned and it is a cooperative and it is a collaborative and an enormous venture at scale, and so often is talked about as how can this kind of concept, democracy, be introduced into organizations that are of a super-sized structure. So Mondragon is one of those. And the next example is another one, DeVita Healthcare, a World Blue freedom-centered workplace, 60,000 employees. This is a company that has an election for the chief executive, or rather, I suppose you'd say a sort of a nomination process for Kent Theory to continue in the role as chief executive if the people want to do it. In fact, I think he calls himself the mayor of DeVita rather than the chief executive. So again, this is a company that votes on things. This is a company that has very open technology and communications. This is a company that has thrived, grown, diversified, and was almost bankrupt before it took the approach to become democratic. So there's a few examples, and so I'm going to leave you with a few kind of hints and some things to think about now before we go to questions. I think I'm just about on time according to what Fran would like me to have done. So behavioural economics and issues in self-managed organisations. So are we going radical or incremental? You know, are we going to go all full pelt and see how we go and almost behaviourally nudge ourselves through this? Or are we going to test and try and use some nudge theory to see how people react? One of the things about self-managed organisations that came from Edmondson and Lee's research is that some people just don't like to work that way, or believe they don't like to work that way. So personality traits are really important. Are people comfortable and drawn to self-managed organizations? If not, you might have to rev behavioral economics up way too much for it to be comfortable with them. This is about choice architecture. And if they're choosing not to work in a self-managed way, I don't think you can force that, as you can't, as hierarchies shouldn't force people in certain ways themselves. Then how do you manage roles? So there are people involved who've got power. And in self-managed organizations, that disperses. There could be a lot of reluctance there. Behavioral economics has a lot to do with how we can manage people to let go of power and to see the benefit in more cooperative and collaborative senses, and how we deal with managers' loss, because in many of those examples I talked about, there just aren't managers. There aren't people who hold that title and have that kind of control over people. So how do we help that? Behavioral economics has a lot to offer in how we can recast the role of manager into coach, advisor, and so on. And then there are definitely some status issues. Even the most successful self-managed organizations will tell you that there are some people who will get the sense that now is their time to step in and grab control of something. And so there's still some agendas at play. So we have to use behavioral economics again in self-managed organizations to try and keep the pure essence of inclusivity, shared accountability, and so on. Individuals will have some experiences of self-managed organizations. So again, I think we need to flush those out. So rather than trying to nudge people towards things, let's have some open dialogue so we can really, really know what the issues are about any reluctance or even absolute exuberance about self-managed organizations. And are we post-bureaucratic? Are we humanist? Are we democratic? Or are we all of them? Because you could be all of them if you want to. So some frames and some references to think about. If in those three types of organizations that have a degree of self-management, how do we use behavioral economics in the right ethical way to assure ourselves that we're doing this, the true essence of self-managed shared accountability. And just to give it another academic underscore, Robert Keegan looked a lot at how people work in terms of self-direction. Hierarchies create and enforce and reinforce status differences that can stifle development and growth needs of others. So if you want an example of where to start thinking about de-hierarching your organization, then look at the sense of development and needs, growth of needs, as an opportunity to see more of that flourish. We've created our own reinvention labs where we hope people can develop some sense of agency and self-management. So if you want to talk to us about that, we'd be really happy to do that. And there's the team, and that's pretty much me done, almost bang on time, Fran, 40 minutes. So it's been my pleasure to sprint through hierarchies and self-managed organizations and the impacts of behavioral economics. If you're in HR and thinking, how does this relate to me? I think it relates to all organizations where HR is particularly at play. And so there's likely to be much more fluidity, agility, and so on coming your way. So self-management often at the heart of that. So thanks very much for that. I will stop sharing screen now and see if we can go back in. And if there are any questions, let's see what we've got, Fran. Look, I'm on time, mate.
Oh, my friend, war attack. Many questions in my mind. I'm blowing away just right now because it's a very hot topic. Trying to create these self-managed teams, and we picked some questions from the audience. The first is, do you think the behaviors which are critical for self-managed team to excel can be measured? If so, how can this be done? That is, how can we know whether we perform the behaviors we want?
Yeah. I mean, it's fantastic, isn't it, this? Because this gets to the heart of stuff in conventional business life that, again, we think we manage pretty well. So, let's use the potential charade of a competency framework, right? We build them in and we say, look, this is how you behave. And then we have this objective, supposedly, assessment by somebody else who says, right, I lead you. This is where I see you complying with these behaviors and not. And then you're like, well, I've got to prove otherwise. So we've got a really flawed system right now that identifies behaviors in the hierarchical system. And I actually think in a self-managed system, the onus is often on individuals to say, these are, I think, are the behaviors that I'm going to need in this self-managed system, because this is all about me having the agency and the sort of, I suppose you'd say, choice architecture here, and people craft it with them. And I think we'll see that horizontal line of people they touch and influence saying, hey, I just wanted you to know that actually, the self-managed principle is about participating in advice decision-making, and you're still a little bit authoritarian there. You're still a little bit too directive. Yeah. This is a much more speak-up environment. So I think we'll see daily measures, daily check-ins, daily adjustments to behaviors, and we'll get rid of the myth that you've got this list of competencies and they direct your every thought and effort, because they don't.
Yeah, sure. Great. The next question is, what do you think about the role of diversity for self-managed organizations? It is so beneficial.
Yeah. So I kind of have a belief more than I have evidence that when you start to disassemble hierarchies and create more self-management, diversity naturally becomes a key component of that, much more than a managed system. So we talk a lot less about privileges because the hierarchical privileges, for example, are gone. So I think it invites people to be feel more included in the fact that there are the removal, perhaps, of those physical structures and things like that. My essence is that actually what it creates is a more sensing approach to things that are relevant to people who've got differences, because you're not talking anymore about roles and experience and power and so on. You're talking about, how do I see this person? How do I sense this person? What do I feel I need to do to adjust to them? So again, I think it becomes naturalized and normalized a lot more. Most of the self-managed organizations I've seen also have a consciousness about the fact that they look around them and don't see enough difference, and they're like, why aren't we more different? And they address it themselves. There's no top-down quota they address it themselves. So I think self-managed organizations give people much more chance to talk about uncomfortable things in a comfortable way.
That is super important. I truly believe in that. But sometimes I have the feeling that to fit the puzzle, to fit diversity, when you are trying to be efficient or more productive, sometimes it's complicated because organizations should face this kind of methodology or the way of work.
Cool.
Great. We have the last. What do you think about the? Sorry.
No, you've got plenty.
Do you think it is possible for a plan of this to operate within one organization, depending on what the outcomes are got particular section of the org?
Yeah. So yes, I've looked at this quite actively because I used to think, well, you've got to go radical and change the whole thing, haven't you? And over the years, I've seen pockets of self-management existing within hierarchical structures. So yes, it is possible to have them in an organization, almost like a hybrid. And so I often describe the organization as a shell where you have some bits that are very hierarchical and you have others which are a bit more free flowing. So think about it more like that sort of diagram. Like, you've got some people in the pens and you've got some people out in the fields using that method. But I think you've got to be careful though, because you've got to start to think then about when the non-hierarchical teams are really pressing for an important organizational decision, do they have to pivot and become hierarchy managers in order to get those kind of results? So I think you've got to think about, again, still making the power a little bit dispersed rather than still sat in a hierarchy. So if you are going to have that hybrid model, just make sure there is a kind of check and balance. So Semco, the Brazilian engineering company, when they were going through this, when Ricardo Semler had a management structure still in place, he said, look, I'm just going to have an open chair. So anybody from Semco can come and join our management team and make a decision with us. And I think that's what you do. You'd have a management team by, sort of functional delineation, but you'd also have a couple of open chairs. So people from the outside the management team can come in and say, right, I'm here, I'm making a decision. Cool,
pretty cool. Probably we have enough time for the last one.
Yeah, let's keep going. I'll be quick.
How do you assess one's ability to thrive in a self-managed?
Okay, so I think there are a couple of things that go on in self-managed organizations. Your sense of how you're thriving is more obvious to you every day because there is much more communication with you from your colleagues, not just functional exchanges. So in self-managed organizations, I've seen it happen. People will absolutely say, hey, when you described that and showed up that way, I saw the impact it had on other people. It was brilliant. And so I just wanted to recognize that. This stuff becomes so much more natural, particularly in the humanistic management side of things. So can you measure how well you're thriving? Absolutely. Because if you're not getting people coming to you, giving you that kind of check-in and feedback on a regular basis, and it doesn't even feel like feedback, it's just lovely exchanges between people, whether it's tough or not, then you're not thriving. Because if nobody's got anything to say to you about how well you're performing in a self-managed environment, you've withdrawn from it. You're a bit vacuous.
My friend, the last one.
Yeah,
I see the last one. You have many questions in the air.
Okay.
Your talk was incredible. The last one. You talk about committing to the cause.
Yeah.
What are the good ways for existing companies to improve their emissions for better buy-in and not just something printed on the walls?
See, that's the best question till last in many ways, actually. So Julia's absolutely right to flag this up. Now, I see a lot of companies who are purpose washing. They are trying to conflate what they do so it sounds really grand and meaningful, and they're putting a few tokenistic sustainability measures and so on and so forth. It's just faking. So genuinely, there are some companies who need to look at themselves and go, what good are we doing to the world? Now, COVID-19 is bringing so much of this into sharp focus because people who would previously have said they've got no mission or cause have suddenly become key workers because they've kept the world going, right? So delivery people, utility workers, whatever. So actually there's a different sense now I think we're having on how we need to describe the value the company creates and the meaning it has. And that doesn't come from the boardroom, I'm telling you that now. That comes from a mass consensus of people who get together and go, what are we all doing here? What is it all about? Who owns us and what do they want from us? And are they the right people to do that? And I think we can create this narrative and this dialogue and this thing that we connect to. But I also think we've got to start reminding ourselves, and this is perhaps where behavioral economics comes in again, is that the meaning is often very close to people. It isn't like the company's moonshot. I hate using that phrase, but you know what I mean. This is something about, these people around me that I turn up with every day. I mean something to them, they with me. We're working on this stuff together. Let's make the meaning very close to us. And stop expecting it to come down from a high that wows you. This is not necessarily the only way we can describe meaning. And often what you'll find in humanistic management structures is that those kind of meanings aggregate up, and then the company listens and go, wow, you lot have given us our meaning. We didn't even need to come up with it.
Well, my friend, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. A great honor. Again, your talk was amazing. Many questions on the chat, chat, and many people commenting your talk. Talk soon. See you soon. Very
great rest of the show, man.
Have a great week.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my friend.